Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always my good friend and comrade Matt Lech. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, and I'm really excited for today. Very, very Left Reckoning episode, something that we should have done a long time ago, but I'm very happy we're doing it today. We're talking with Tarence Ray of the Trillbillies. We'll be talking about Red State America and his excellent piece in The Nation, How America Invented the Red State. But really happy to be doing this. And Terrence, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Phyllis.
Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in your piece and definitely some kind of recent history maybe we could go through. But I want to start with the thing that kind of shocked me the most in your piece that I didn't know about. Could you explain the color map of American politics? Because I didn't realize how recent this red and blue thing was.
Yeah, it used to be flipped, like the color codes of Republican red and Democrat blue used to be reversed in the 1970s. I think it was the Carter election in 1976 was the first election that they tried to do this color-coded scheme of red and blue. But they've always done, so like, the Electoral College is a very confusing and complex thing for a lot of Americans. And so to relay election results, they've always had to find out a way to make it discernible for a lot of people. Like as 20th century media progressed and you had more competitive attempts to make this very Byzantine complex process more discernible to the everyday layman, they tried to make it as simple as possible. So that's when they landed on the red and blue of the late 70s. And like that first attempt, actually, they built like a massive, I don't know, it was like 30 feet tall or something like that, like light bulb stricken map that I think almost burned down the studios at the time. I think that was NBC. And then of course it flipped in the 2000 election. And I did a lot of research on this for writing this piece. I was trying to figure out why did they decide on red and blue? And there was no really consensus on this. But it seems that the consensus is that the reason it stuck was precisely because the 2000 election results were contested. And so you had this 6-week recount process where the, Republican red, Democrat blue color code got kind of burned into everyone's mind as they were recounting the Florida votes in 2000. So yeah, no, it's a weird story as to how do we even tell the story of American politics to people? It's very complex.
It's always been disorientating for David and I because we're both from states that are coded as red now. That when we were born were like blue. I'm from North Dakota. Dave's from Texas, where they had a long stand. And actually, my mom's from a dairy farm. I remember going to the farm and talking politics, and my city boy dad said he was voting for Bush in 2000 and got an earful from all of the farmers in southeastern North Dakota. And now I think that sort of idea would blow people's minds.
Yeah.
Now.
It blew Thomas Frank's mind. He's a character in the story that I wrote. I disagree with him on a lot of stuff. That book, What's the Matter with Kansas, is both very enlightening and I think very kind of astute. It's funny. He's a good kind of comedic writer, but it's also kind of maddening because I think he frames up the question. I mean, that's kind of where my entire piece started. The question of why do people in these states vote against their interests is something that it's always kind of hit me the wrong way, not because it's incorrect I guess it is incorrect. I guess the framing assumes something. The question already assumes something up front, which is that voting for the Democrats would be in their interest. And it's just, the Democrats haven't proven that in the last 30 years that would be the case. And I guess that's kind of why it's not really set well. But if you go to...
I think that, yeah.
I was gonna say, David, if you go to West Texas, there's towns called New Deal. You know what I mean? There's a lot of in Kansas and that kind of stuff. From that sort of farmer labor alliance of the early 20th century, you see that kind of residual effect of that. Sorry to cut you off.
No, you didn't cut me off at all. I mean, I was undoubtedly there's a great history. And I mean, this is Thomas Frank's work, right? It's sort of Kansas was such a center of the populist movement, though I'd argue, Texas is pretty high up there, frankly. But The assumption that you're getting at here is that, like, oh yeah, voting Democrat is sort of like in their interest. I think is a way that, like, I think leftists, like, when they deal with quote unquote red states or rural America, more generally, I think they kind of mistake why people do the things that they do, and they don't recognize it. Like, no, they do have interests, and sometimes those interests are different than yours. I mean, this is something that we've talked about with Keith Orell about, like, the kind of history of rural America and capitalism in rural America, and how that relates to the Republican Party and the specific pitch that Republicans made. There's a great book called The Rural Voter that just came out recently. And, despite the kind of portrayal of rural America just sort of raging and being super angry about everything, like, people are pretty mad, and they're pretty mad about this thing called NAFTA, which everybody always ignores as a major betrayal of a traditional base, frankly, in a lot of states for the Democratic Party. So, I mean, if there's anything there that you want to pick up on, I'm happy to hear it. But I'm also, like, I'm curious what you think about this, like, rural red state combination that goes on, right? Because these are two different things. When we talk about a red state, I mean, Texas is like for example, like, Texas is one of the most urban states in the country, right? Yeah. And yet, we are a red state. Right? There is this kind of, like, slippage in the way that we talk about red state and rural America when we might be, meaning one or the other, right?
For sure. I think that's partially what I was trying to understand in my piece, which is that, like, I find the entire construction of red states versus blue states sort of perplexing. And furthermore, the conflation with rural America that you're pointing out, simply because every state has rural areas. I mean, I guess maybe, like, New Jersey. New Jersey has rural. I've driven through New Jersey, though. There's even Pine Barrens, they've got rural areas there, too.
I have a Mennonite friend from New Jersey.
There you go. I mean, it's like a diverse, we've got a diverse sort of template to kind of work from. But I guess I'm trying to understand, like, how this moniker, really how this, like, paradigm got to be constructed in the first place. And what I find really fascinating is that, like we were just talking about at the top of the program, it began after the 2000 election. And I've kind of just, like, this is not an original observation by any means. We're all well familiar with it. But it really is fascinating that every election now, pretty much since then, it's a foregone conclusion that these states are unwinnable. And by the Democrats. I'm sorry, I should specify. They just automatically write those states off. And I'm not here to say that, like, oh, they are winnable, like, you could win them back. Because I don't even know if that's true. I kind of think, I've lived in Kentucky for over about 13 years now, and I don't really think that anything the Democrats could do would be really able to rehabilitate their brand. However, at the same time, I do think that the left, if it's serious about, making it a political intervention in national politics, has to try to understand how power is reproduced in rural America and what's going on there. And because, a lot of people live there. But as I've tried to point out over the course of my writing career and podcasting career, that's where raw materials come from. Like, that's where food comes from. That's where coal and natural gas come from. That's where the land, these prized, like, massive plots of land for farming or ranching are. And you're starting to see this now, how it's starting to enter the sort of cultural lexicon of American politics, not just through the Republican Party, but through, like, these cultural products like Yellowstone, the Taylor Sheridan shows. You know what I'm saying? So I think that the left, it's obvious to me that the liberals aren't really interested anymore, but the left is going to have to try to come up with a political economy of it that's resonant with people and speaks to their experiences.
Yeah, it seems like the structural forces always get underplayed, and I like the section you had on the sort of anthropological pathologizing of folks, both by the right, the Charles Murray types, some J.D. Vance, and it's the flip side, other side of the coin by the liberals with the whole dying of whiteness sort of stuff. I'm curious which side of that you want to speak to.
Yeah, so this is something that, like, I was trying to understand. I came up with this formulation because I was trying to understand, like, what do we make of Tim Walz? Of all the people in the 2020 election, I think he was kind of the most fascinating, but he's also the one that was sort of sidelined more than anyone. And so I was trying to understand, like, what is what was that about? That's weird that like the first 2 weeks, everyone was really excited, like, oh, they might be trying to do something different, break from the norm, etc. And then they started campaigning with the Cheneys, and you didn't really hear from Tim Walz at all after that. So I was like trying to understand how liberals have tried to understand rural America since 2020. And really where this all began was with a book that I received in the mail last year. Someone asked me to review it. It was called White Rural Rage. Have you all heard of this book? I can't remember the writer's name.
Yeah, we've covered it.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Yeah, and so I was...
Jonathan Metzl.
Right. Or Metzl is Dying of Whiteness. Right? White Rural Rage is these two guys. They're like MSNBC
Paul
guys.
Waldman and Thomas Schaller.
There we go.
Waldman and Schaller, yeah.
Waldman and Schaller. As I was like reading their book, I was like, how do you get something like this? Like, what is... And just for the audience, like a brief overview of that book is basically that we have a growing constitutional and political crisis in this country, best represented by the provincial rubes in the backwater areas, in the rural areas, and that they are a existential threat to America. And the argument was like, to me, it was pretty shocking, but at the same time, it was not really out of the blue. It feels like liberals have been kind of circling this for a while. But I was like trying to understand, like, how do you get this book in 2024? The same year you also get Tim Walz. You've got these weird like steps forward, these steps back. So I was like trying to go through the entire historiography of how liberals have tried to understand rural America since 2000. It really did start with Thomas Frank. It started with What's the Matter with Kansas? And we mentioned it already, but his premise was like, how do you start off with a state like Kansas that had this long storied populist farmer labor alliance history going back to the New Deal? Fast forward 80 years and they vote for George W. Bush in huge margins. And I had Frank and Bagent, Joe Bagent, who wrote this book called Deer Hunting with Jesus. That like I see them as kind of like populist writers, right? Like they were kind of on the ground. Their lives were kind of embedded in the lives of their subjects. They were genuinely, in my opinion, interested in how to come up with a better form of liberalism that would cater to the rural subject. But then I think after the 2008 recession, after the election of Obama, and after the rise of the Tea Party is when you get a new mode of analysis on rural America. And I call that like anthropology. You get a lot of these anthropological writers who are kind of interested. They're not so much interested in how to reform the Democratic Party to make these people's lives better. They're more interested in the kind of psychological interiority of these people. And it's really kind of stunning the degree to which they employ a lot of these same psychological metrics and empiricism that you would kind of see in the 1960s when people studying like poverty in places like Appalachia. And these books are all really, they're kind of amusing, they're kind of they're really tone deaf, but they're kind of like Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Russell Hochschild is a kind of like paradigmatic example of this. And there's this guy named Robert Wuffnow. I think he's a professor at Princeton. He's written a lot of books in this vein too. And I think that like, these writers kind of seeded the ground for J.D. Vance, really. Like by the time J.D. Vance came along, there had been this anthropological mode of inquiry into rural America that J.D. Vance was able to really plug into. And that's why liberals loved his book. I mean, they made that book what it was. And then, to fast forward a few more years, by the time you get to 2024, you've got a distinct kind of fatalism. And that's best represented by that White Rural Rage book. And I think that you saw that entire process play out in about 6 weeks in the 2024 election, where they started off with this populist, like Tim Walz thing. Then they went into this kind of like self-inquiry, like, oh, well, do we really understand rural America? And by the end, it had become this fatalistic project where they were like, we don't want Tim Walz anywhere near this. And they'd kind of sidelined them. So I think, that's a really long answer, but like that's kind of this process. And if I was to guess, I'd say we're probably going to see a similar process start all over.
It's fascinating the way the camo merch sort of was the last sort of remnant of Walzian influence, and that was sort of adopted by, I think I'd say, like younger folks who maybe were more ambivalent about the ticket in general, but there's at least that camo that maybe nods toward another idea.
Like, I just want to piggyback on that and hear your opinion, Terence, because I'm curious in your part of the world, like here, like, you know, I'm in Austin, and like, you know, there's been this whole kind of like cowboy couture thing going on, right? As like more and more new folks move here, and you know, they start dressing up and acting a certain way. And I'm curious if y'all are having a similar thing. You know, in Kentucky, I feel like in certain cities, like they also, I see at least on Instagram, you know, that I'll get kind of ads for certain brands and stuff out of there. But I'm curious if that's the case there, and I'm curious, like, you know, about how you think that does relate to that kind of camo Walsh Harris cap, because there's part of me that's like, I think they should embrace some kind of imagery that they've been sort of afraid to touch. But there was something about that one that, you know, it didn't.
Yeah, I think that, yes, that's definitely happened in Kentucky. With Kentucky, it's kind of more along the lines of it's kind of coming out of like the 1990s, early 2000s fascination with the South. So it's more in like bourbon and horses and stuff. I think what you're describing, David, is more of a kind of fetishization of the West and of cowboy culture. And genuinely, Thomas Frank had an op-ed right after the election, after the 2024 election, where he was basically talking about, like, I think the opening line is like, when did you realize that the Democrats were doomed? My moment was when I was in a museum and I saw something about settler colonialism. And it kind of like clicked for me. I was like, everybody wants to reclaim some sort of Americana or some sort of like bygone era of when you could, you know, feasibly be sort of naive about the conquest of North America, because that kind of united us all. That was like our kind of uniting national spirit, and it allowed for, in some ways, these kind of alliances between labor and farmers and everything else. But like, I'm kind of at the point now where like Thomas Frank asks, like, what's the matter with Kansas? It's kind of like, I mean, I think it's the settler colonialism. I think that like this whole process of fetishization of the land, of our rugged individualism, of our you know, Protestant work ethic, all of this has created something that we would all like to try to recapture as best embodied in that camo hat. But none of us can really get it. It's always going that specific thing is always going to read down to the right, because that is a reactionary historical process. Like, it's not something that the left in any way can really reclaim or engage in. And even furthermore, I've pointed this out before, but like, there's also nothing inherently working class about camo. I mean, I know rich guys that fucking wear camo and go shoot, you know, bucks and stuff. Like, there's nothing inherently working class about a cowboy hat. Like, these are all like symbols. So yeah, go ahead.
No. In fact, Terence, I just have to add. And look, I'm like all in this kind of stuff. You know, like you know, I have a good collection of Stetsons and things like that. But Stetsons traditionally were like the boss, Yeah. You might aspire to have one, right? You might aspire, and then maybe you got one, right? But like, it was never this kind of thing that like only like, you know, the people on the bottom end of the tone pole were getting it. No, this was always a kind of elite. Anyway, no, I think that is a good point as well. Which is, I think this is the thing that is kind of odd, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this, about, you know, the separation of like the American media and the political class. And I know a lot of conversation about this kind of like literal geographical divide that just like almost, I mean, you know, I lived in New York City for a while, and I lived near Matt, and I was in this kind of Facebook group for like my block, and I realized, oh my Lord, almost everybody who works at like the Atlantic and the New York Times is like renting a little area, right? Like, there is a concentration of folks, and that means that like there is like a lack of connection. So I'm curious, you know, what role or what your thoughts are on that aspect about, like, you know, the way that rural or red state America is sort of talked about or written about, because there is such a hyper concentration of, you know, the media in certain parts of the country.
Well, I think that something that I pointed out in the piece, in which I think very much contributed to what I call like the kind of fatalistic strain of inquiry about rural America, is this line you see a lot from recently departed New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, which is that the red states basically mooch off of the blue states, that like the blue states subsidize the red states. There is a truth to that, in the sense that, like, okay, right now they're talking about cutting Medicaid. If they cut Medicaid, a lot of red states are going to suffer, because they don't have the surplus, they don't have the tax base really to make up for that loss. So they do, I mean, the federal government does keep a lot of these red states afloat. But like formulating it in this welfare queen type language, this, you know what I'm saying? That is not, it's not helpful, first of all, but it's also not really true. And this kind of gets into my problem with asking about voting against their own interests and even using voting as a metric for what a person thinks or what they feel or how they want the country to go or whatever. I think that a lot of people here in Kentucky, they're not actively going out there and voting for, we want New York's money. Like, I don't even know how people vote. I don't know what the calculus is in their minds or whatever. I think voting is something that is almost sort of, it's like a occluded alchemy or something. It's like not really anything I can ever understand. But if you're actually trying to understand rural America and the people that live there, you have to understand, you have to look at the political economy of the place. And by that, I mean, you have to look at two things: a person's relationship to the means of production and their relationship to land. I think that those two things would give you a pretty good explanation of what's going on in a community, how power is reproduced, how people think that they have autonomy over their lives and can control their futures. And then you can get into some inquiries about, like, well, who would they support? Who would they not? There's a really good book by this sociologist named Jennifer Silva named We're Still Here that I think does a really good job of surveying a lot of people in these Rust Belt areas, these rural areas, and trying to get into like the nitty gritty detail of what they believe and why they believe it. I think that does a good job of mixing political economy with that. But for the most part, it's people like, Hochschild and Robert Wuthnow or whatever going into a community and using a kind of like pre-formulated set of parameters and framework to basically impose their own sort of understanding on, and not on really how the community works, but on how the people there think. Because, I mean, that's really what we're kind of like talking about at the end of the day. Like they really want to know, because that's kind of the way that like liberal virtue politics work. Like a person can only get, like means testing. Mm-hmm. Like the person can only receive benefits if they believe the right thing. So he's like, all of that stuff that's not scientific, first of all. It's not Marxist. It kind of gets into like a populist vein, but like you really have to look at the material circumstances. Like rural people aren't sacred. They're not more authentic. They're not any of these things. They're just people caught in a social nexus, and you have to understand that, I guess.
I just want to make another plug for people to read The Rural Voter, because it's a really interesting piece, because in it, they basically take mass opinion polls across the country in rural and urban America. And one thing that's kind of interesting is, despite the kind of narrative that like hard right positions like on guns and abortion even are actually the most concentrated, the strongest in rural America versus urban America, is not true. And just a quick like explainer of that, like when you think of the megachurch, which is what everyone talks about when they talk about red, that's in Houston. Right, those are in like the cities. Yeah. They're not. In fact, like across America, churches are closing down. Right.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things. Like people sometimes I also think statistically have a hard time considering these kind of problems, because even in a quote unquote red state, these aren't states that are 20% Democrat and 80% Republican too. Like these are like, they're states that are more, that are going to be harder to win, because 10 points is a lot to win. But that's a lot of people when you're saying 40% of the population, is voting one way.
Well, and I think that something that I've tried to also show through writing, especially in Eastern Kentucky, is that a lot of political economy gets meted out through regional power blocks. And by that, I mean, if you were to go, there is this thing called One East Kentucky. It's like a industrial park company in Eastern Kentucky. And if you go to their website, like on the, these big, they've got these pie charts, these numbers and everything. They're advertising to developers and to capitalists. It's like Eastern Kentucky is 95% union free. They are hardworking people. It gets into all these pathological things about their nature, their Scots-Irish heritage. They work hard. They are dedicated to work, but they're not union. And so you want to relocate your business here, right? Because you can make more money if you do that. Well, I mean, it's not really true because Eastern Kentucky is way out of the way. At this point, if you're trying to make more money, you would be better off relocating to somewhere like in Ohio or, you know what I mean, something like that. But the way that, in my opinion, these politics work out and how power is reproduced is through these kind of like regionally circumscribed like identity markers. And that, I mean, that it opens up a whole other, realm of discussion. But I think that my point here is that if you're looking into like how a person's ideology is formulated and framed and how they engage with politics, you also have to look at how their community leaders and business leaders sell their region to capitalists in other parts of the country. Because that has knock-on effects at the local level in terms of like their school board makeup, the ideological content of their fucking textbooks. These, you know what I mean? Like, this is like microscopic stuff at a certain point. But I guess my point is just that like this differs really from place to place. It's not going to be the same in Eastern Kentucky that it is in like rural Wisconsin or something. And part of the reason it is that way in Eastern Kentucky is because Eastern Kentucky used to have a huge union history. The entire healthcare system was built up literally through the UMWA, the mine workers union. And as those jobs were just rolled away and rolled back and destroyed, the union was as well. And so now, local business leaders are basically begging with capitalists to relocate their Bitcoin mines to Eastern Kentucky or their widget factories or whatever, on the basis that like, look, we're not in unions anymore. We're still hardworking, but we're not like, we're not organized and solidaristic anymore. We only care about ourselves. And again, that's not even true either. So it's a lot of powerful people trying to formulate what a person thinks. Some of them are well-meaning libs. Some of them are not well-meaning. Some of them are, powerful conservatives in extractive industries and real estate. But it's something that like, I think that leftists are going to have to like start looking at in more fine detail. It took, be back against that.
Well, I mean, I think that, people on the left in general are just going to have to get more serious about figuring out how to win people to our program anywhere, right? Which is sort of like, I think just the general point that sometimes folks tend to mystify people in this country. But Terence, I mean, I would love to, to keep going. People should read the piece, How America Invented the Red State. But I do want to talk about one last thing before we let you go, which is sort of talking about mystification. I think, all three of us probably share the same kind of like belief in like, the radical potential of like working class people, like in our, in our home areas and, what's possible. And also all of us, I think, are very interested in the history and sort of like correcting the narrative a little bit. But I had to ask you about, there was a few years ago, it's less so now, but it was really popular, these kind of like Southern fried memes. And don't get me wrong, some of them were fun, but they were basically, for people who are unfamiliar, it was basically this idea that like out in the country, there's just like this radical proletariat that is just, they're just actually waiting for like their most radical communist party. The reason that they're not engaged in politics is because everyone's too reformist. I mean, Terence, could you help us sort of find a middle road between like maybe that and the kind of pessimistic view that liberals have of like red America?
Yeah, I think that if there's any main consistency, anything that I've stuck with since we started doing our show in 2017, tried to write about over the years, is that most of these people are just apolitical. They are ground down by a set of material forces that, I mean, I can't even, if you were to go to Eastern Kentucky, what a person is facing, just a regular person is facing on a day-to-day basis, their survival strategies have been heavily criminalized. That involves, like, they've been pushed out of the formal workforce, first of all. And that means they've had to rely on the informal economy, selling copper, doing, just landscaping work for cash, selling drugs. A lot of these things have been heavily criminalized. So if they can't get a job in the formal economy, which they likely can't, they have to resort to the informal economy, which is heavily militarized and surveilled and watched over by a massive police state in a lot of these rural areas. The New York Times did a huge story about this last year about, like, I think per capita, the number of police shootings is actually higher in rural America. If it's not higher, it's an insane number that you wouldn't even think. Like, the way, the degree to which people in rural areas are policed and surveilled by police officers is in some ways even more repressive, because a lot of the times the police officer. You know what I'm saying? Like, their family. They know your family. They can keep a tighter reign of control over your life. So, like, their interaction with the police state, with the rehabilitation industrial complex. All of these things on top of trying to just make ends meet with living paycheck to paycheck, raising rent, increasing natural disasters. Eastern Kentucky has gone through 2 1,000-year floods in the last 2-3 years. When do these people have any time for organizing in any kind of meaningful way? The best they can do is they see what's on TV, and honestly, there was a miners' blockade where a bunch of coal miners blockaded I don't know if y'all remember this, like in 2019, they blockaded a coal train. And I went down to that, I spent the entire time with them down at that blockade. The 2 politicians I heard them talk the most shit about was AOC and Mitch McConnell. So it's like that kind of just like they're just kind of like every other person. You know what I'm saying? Like they have some beliefs here, they have some beliefs there. But until somebody is actually able to harness their anger and point it towards something that like has an actual shot at making their lives better, then yeah, I mean, they're pretty much apolitical. You know what I'm saying? They're not swamp Maoists ready to start shooting landlords or anything like that. But
not yet.
I do think there's potential for radicalism there, precisely because their life circumstances they're very radical. So
no, I mean I think it's more that like there's a lot of potential and we just have to be serious about it. And again, those are meant in jest, but I do think sometimes we got a little ahead of ourselves with some of that stuff, I think, for a moment.
The Dale Earnhardt memes were fun. They were fun for a while, but yeah. Dale Earnhardt was probably a liberal, if I had to guess. Sorry.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Well, that's the thing that's funny about it is like more often than not, like what you actually probably are going to get is more middle liberalism from that kind of thing. But Terence, really, it was so wonderful being able to speak with you. Folks should be listening to the Trillbillies. We'll have a link, obviously, to both that and to this excellent piece in The Nation. Anything else people should be on looking out for?
I write every now and then for The Nation. I also write for The Baffler. So definitely go check out my writing there at The Baffler, because there's some good stuff there too.
Well, thank you very much, Terence.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's been a blast.